Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever just stopped dead in your tracks and thought, what is time anyway? I mean, we're constantly chasing it, scheduling around it, setting alarms. And yet, what if the very thing we're so concerned with isn't quite what we think it is?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Those really fundamental questions, the ones kids ask about, the stars, where we came from, even what happens when we're no longer here,
Hmm.
they naturally lead you to start poking at something as seemingly solid as our understanding of time.
Exactly. And that's precisely where we're headed today. We're taking a deep dive into some truly mind-bending ideas about the nature of time, all sparked by your curiosity. We're going to explore how our picture of the cosmos has evolved over history, from those early explanations rooted in religion to the very complex Big Bang theory we have now.
And if we, connect this to the bigger picture, you see this constant refinement of our understanding of the universe. What was accepted dogma centuries ago, often tied to religious beliefs, gradually gave way to more scientific models, like the idea of a cosmic egg in some cultures and ultimately the Big Bang. It really highlights how our knowledge is always, well, a work in progress, shaped by the era and the available information.
Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Time. Come on, it's real. I've got a packed calendar right here. And trust me, that makes perfect sense. We experience things changing, we have deadlines looming, and let's not forget the undeniable march of aging. But stick with us, because some incredibly smart people have actually questioned this seemingly obvious reality.
Yeah. This raises a really important question. What is the most fundamental, undeniable truth we can hold on to? While we might feel absolutely certain about the timeline of the universe, stretching from the Big Bang to right now, the one truly irrefutable starting point is, well, our own awareness, our consciousness existing within this reality we call the universe.
Right. It's that whole I think, therefore I am thing that throws a bit of a curveball.
Hmm.
Because when you start with consciousness, you realize that science, in its current form, can't actually answer some of the most basic questions about existence, the kind even a curious kid might ask.
That's a crucial point to grasp. Those incredibly precise numbers and dates that cosmology throws around, like 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, they gain an air of undeniable truth just through, repetition. But it's vital to remember that these are models, our best current attempts to describe reality, not necessarily absolute set in stone facts.
So we find ourselves in this situation where the standard explanation of the cosmos can sometimes feel a little, well, incomplete and maybe even a bit unsatisfying. But the good news is this somewhat murky overview isn't the end of the story. It's actually just the jumping off point because there are alternative ways of thinking about what all this is.
Right, and the alternative is worth considering because modern cosmology often makes a rather curious separation. It tends to keep the living, conscious observer at arm's length from the rest of the universe. It creates this division, us on one side, the ones doing the observing, and the inert universe on the other, just ticking along through random processes.
It's like we're watching a play about the universe, but we're not allowed to step onto the stage. But here's where it gets really interesting. This idea that the observer is somehow separate isn't a universally accepted one. Think about how much knowledge that was commonplace just a couple of centuries ago is now met with like a blank stare.
What's fascinating here is the way common knowledge shifts. A
Mhm.
farmer in the 1830s would have had an incredibly detailed understanding of things like sunrise patterns and bird calls, things that many people today are completely oblivious to. It highlights that knowledge isn't simply about accumulating more facts. It's about what a society chooses to focus on and value at a particular time. Yeah.
Exactly. We've gained incredible insights in certain areas, like understanding how germs cause disease or discovering planets we can't even see with the naked eye. But we've also lost touch with other really fundamental understandings of the natural world. And when it comes to the really big questions, the very structure of the cosmos, how we perceive it, how it's all connected well, People were wrestling with these ideas way back in ancient times.
Uh-huh. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a very long history of humanity trying to make sense of reality. Ancient texts, like the Rig Veda in India, pondered the very nature of existence with a kind of poetic simplicity, constantly observing the ever changing nature of things.
Night and morning clash not, nor yet do linger. I mean, that's a pretty elegant way of saying stuff happens. You've got to appreciate it. And you mentioned ancient Greece too, right? Aristotle had this concept of a fundamentally interconnected universe, one that was eternal and had no beginning. It's kind of wild to think about a major philosopher arguing against a starting point so long ago.
What's significant about Aristotle's view is precisely this emphasis on inherent connectedness and the idea of an eternal cosmos. This is quite different from later Western models that strongly emphasized a creation event. Interestingly, a very similar concept arose in the East with Advaita Vedanta.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that.
Advaita Vedanta, through its core texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas, also proposed a single underlying reality called Brahman. But unlike the Greek ideas, this one encompassed both the divine and the individual self. The appearance of separateness of individual beings was considered to be an illusion, much like mistaking a piece of rope in dim light for a snake.
Wow. So you have these influential thinkers in both the East and the West thousands of years ago suggesting this deep interconnectedness, this idea that what we perceive as separate entities might not actually be. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If someone demands purely fact-based scientific evidence, can science alone definitively tackle these really profound questions about the nature of reality?
That's really the central question, isn't it? The one that opens up so much deeper exploration. Because throughout history, being significantly ahead of your time and understanding some fundamental aspect of life hasn't always been a benefit. Think about Aristarchus, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system centuries before Copernicus. Not exactly a household name for most people, is he?
Nope, doesn't usually ring a bell. Okay, so no matter what picture of the universe we subscribe to, time seems to be a pretty central player. Our current scientific models are so deeply rooted in the concept of time that they can't really be understood or even disproven without also grappling with the very nature of time itself. So let's dive into this whole idea of what time actually is.
Yeah, and this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. It goes right to the heart of how we perceive reality and sits right at the intersection between us, the observers, and the natural world. We are, without a doubt, obsessed with time. We meticulously plan our days, eagerly anticipate the future, and many of us even contemplate what might happen after time, as we know it, ends for us.
It's so true. If there's one major difference between humans and, say, your average squirrel, it's probably not just that we're terrified of vacuum cleaners. It's that we're constantly thinking about time. On one level, what we commonly mean by time is undeniably real. Our GPS tells us we'll arrive in a certain city in a specific amount of time, and generally speaking, we do.
Right. Moreover, as we travel, countless other events are unfolding within our own bodies and all over the planet, all seemingly being measured by this consistent flow of time. But this everyday, seemingly straightforward experience of time starts to get really wobbly when you start looking at how different cultures and even science itself have conceived of it.
Right. The ancient Hindus, for example, developed this incredibly intricate system of time intervals, ranging from the infinitesimally small to the practically unimaginable, like the Mahamanvantara, which is just mind-bogglingly long. Their units of time were even deeply connected to their creation and destruction myths.
What's fascinating here is just how deeply woven the concept of time has been into the fabric of cosmology and mythology across so many different cultures. It really reflects a fundamental human need to try and understand our place within some kind of temporal framework.
And then you get to Einstein and his theory of relativity, and suddenly time isn't this fixed universal constant anymore. It becomes relative to the observer's speed and the strength of the gravitational field they're in. It's almost like time has its own quirky personality, speeding up or slowing down depending on where you are and how fast you're moving.
Indeed. We don't intuitively grasp this because our everyday experiences happen within a relatively weak gravitational field and at speeds far, far below the speed of light. To experience a significant slowing down of time, you'd have to be moving at a truly staggering percentage of light speed.
Astronauts actually experience this to a very, very tiny degree,
Hmm.
right? Their time runs ever so slightly slower due to their high speeds, although the weaker gravity they're in tries to speed it up a bit, but the speed difference wins out. So they age just a fraction less quickly than us folks stuck here on Earth.
Uh-huh. And it's not just these extreme conditions. Even subtle differences in gravity and the Earth's rotation speed at different locations on the planet can lead to minuscule but measurable inconsistencies in how time passes. Time literally ticks at slightly different rates depending on where you happen to be. So your watch on top of a mountain and a watch in a deep valley would be ever so slightly out of sync over a long period.
It's enough to make your head spin. But here's the real kicker. As natural and intuitive as our feeling of a constantly flowing present moment is, you won't actually find it explicitly reflected in the fundamental equations of physics.
That's absolutely right. The present moment, that feeling of now, doesn't exist as a defined variable in those core equations. They're more like a map of reality without the you are here symbol. And Einstein's theories of relativity take it even further, suggesting that all moments in time are equally real, not just this fleeting now that we experience.
This idea of the present moment might not be particularly special, that all of time is sort of there all at once. It really goes against the grain of our daily lives. But this whole debate about the true nature of time isn't a new one, is it? We touched on how several classical Greek writers believed the universe was eternal, which would kind of make the concept of a linear flowing time seem less significant.
Exactly. Thinkers like Antiphon the Sophist, way back in the 5th century BCE, actually argued that time is not a reality, but a concept or a measure. Parmenides echoed this idea, calling time an illusion and stating that true fundamental existence is timeless, unchanging.
An illusion. That's a pretty bold statement to make. And then you had Zeno, who came up with these incredibly thought-provoking paradoxes, like the famous one of the tortoise and the hare, that seemed to demonstrate how motion itself might actually be impossible if you break it down into infinitely small moments in time.
Zeno's paradoxes are incredibly important because they really highlight the potential disconnect between the conceptual world of our ideas in mathematics versus the actual physical world we experience. These paradoxes, though debated for centuries, can be seen as arising from this very act of switching between the abstract and the physical. In the abstract realm of endless division, motion might seem impossible, but in the real world, you can quite clearly just walk across the room.
It's almost like our brains, which are so good at recognizing patterns and using logic, sometimes get tripped up by the way we try to symbolize and divide up reality into these neat little boxes. We sometimes forget that the actual world doesn't necessarily play by the same rules as our language and our abstract concepts.
Precisely. And this brings us to the concept of entropy, which at first glance seems like the one area of physics that definitively argues for a direction to time, a clear arrow of time. Because in most other fundamental areas of physics, the core equations are time symmetrical, meaning the events they describe could theoretically run forward or backward in time and still make sense mathematically.
So entropy, this natural tendency for things to go from a state of order to a state of disorder, that feels inherently linked to the direction of time, right? Like a neatly organized sock drawer never spontaneously reorganizes itself. It only ever gets messier.
That's the common and very intuitive understanding, yeah. And Ludwig Boltzmann's groundbreaking work on statistical mechanics seemed to provide a strong scientific basis for this. He demonstrated how colliding particles in a gas would statistically tend to move towards states of increasing disorder or entropy over time. This progression from more structure to less structure appears to be a one-way, irreversible process.
So the ever-increasing messiness of the universe seemed like pretty compelling evidence for a real directional flow of time. But you mentioned that Boltzmann himself didn't necessarily see it in quite that way.
That's correct. While Boltzmann's work is foundational to our understanding of entropy, he actually argued that entropy isn't a fundamental arrow of time pushing things in one direction, but rather simply the statistical consequence of living in a universe with a vast number of particles where disordered states are overwhelmingly more probable than highly ordered ones. Randomization is a process that happens in the present moment. There's no inherent force driving things towards disorder over time. It's just the most likely outcome at any given instant.
Ooh, okay. So if time doesn't actually exist in the way we intuitively think it does, then what is it that we're experiencing in our everyday lives? This is where things start to get really mind-bending when we begin to consider the role of our own consciousness.
Exactly. If time isn't this fundamental framework we assume it is, then we need to understand what we are experiencing, who is doing the experiencing, and how our lives unfold in this alternative view. And this naturally leads us to the realm of quantum physics, which has really thrown a major wrench into our classical understanding of reality.
Quantum mechanics,
Yeah.
the physics of the incredibly small, where things behave in ways that are just utterly bizarre compared to our everyday experiences. Even way back in the 17th century, René Descartes was grappling with this fundamental question of the relationship between our minds and the physical matter that makes up the world, these two seemingly distinct realms.
Descartes had a very logical reason for proposing this separation. He reasoned that for mind and matter to interact, there would need to be some kind of energy exchange. But no one had ever observed an object's energy changing simply by being observed by a conscious mind. This led him to the influential idea of two fundamentally distinct and separate realms, the mental and the physical.
And this idea of Cartesian dualism, this clear split between mind and matter, really had a profound impact on the development of Western science, didn't it?
Mhm.
It essentially allowed science to proceed with its material explanations of the universe while leaving the realm of the mind, of consciousness, to the domain of philosophy and religion.
It did indeed. The Newtonian Cartesian worldview essentially painted the cosmos as a giant, intricate machine, a deterministic game of billiards, where if you knew all the initial conditions with perfect accuracy, you could, in theory, perfectly predict the entire future. Pierre-Simon Laplace even famously surmised that with sufficient intelligence and information, one could know everything about the universe, past and present.
It was this very idea of a clockwork universe, wasn't it? Everything predetermined, with no real mystery left except maybe the very initial spark that set it all in motion. But then along came quantum mechanics and just completely upended that neat and tidy picture.
Indeed. Starting with seemingly simple puzzles at the very end of the 19th century, like the unexpected spectrum of light emitted by heated objects, the ultraviolet catastrophe, or why a bonfire doesn't give you a suntan, quantum mechanics gradually revealed a reality that was far, far stranger and more counterintuitive than our classical understanding had ever suggested.
Right. Max Planck's revolutionary idea of energy being quantized, existing in discrete packets, and Niels Bohr's model of the atom with electrons jumping instantaneously between specific orbits. It was like the universe at its most fundamental level wasn't smooth and continuous as we thought, but came in these distinct, indivisible chunks.
Imagine the moon behaving like that, suddenly jumping to a completely new orbit around the Earth without traversing the space in between. That's somewhat analogous to how electrons behave within atoms. And yet, despite these already profound oddities, the truly bizarre aspects of quantum mechanics were really just beginning to be uncovered.
Like this mind-boggling idea of non-locality, The spooky action at a distance that Albert Einstein famously disliked so much, where two entangled subatomic particles seem to instantaneously know what the other is doing, even when they are separated by vast, seemingly insurmountable distances.
Einstein, deeply rooted in classical physics, firmly believed in the principle of locality, the idea that an object can only be directly influenced by its immediate surroundings. This apparent instantaneous correlation between entangled particles seemed to flagrantly violate that core principle, hence his colorful description of it as spooky action at a distance. However, numerous experiments since then have definitively confirmed these so-called EPR correlations, showing that this non-local connection is indeed a real and fundamental feature of quantum reality.
Wow. It's almost as if these entangled particles are like two sides of the same fundamental coin, instantly and mysteriously linked in a way that completely defies our classical understanding of space and time as separate and independent entities. And John Archibald Wheeler's idea of the participatory universe takes this even a step further, suggesting that our very act of observing at the quantum level actually plays a crucial role in bringing about what appears to be happening.
Wheeler proposed some truly fascinating mind experiments to illustrate this concept, one of the most famous being a variation of the double-slit experiment involving light from a distant quasar that has passed by a foreground galaxy billions of years ago. The seemingly paradoxical idea is that the way we choose to observe that light now can retroactively seem to determine which path it took all those billions of years ago.
That's just absolutely mind-blowing. The notion that our present-day observations could somehow influence events that happened in the distant past, it strongly hints at a reality where time isn't this rigid linear progression from cause to effect that we so intuitively experience. And this strange quantum behavior isn't just confined to the incredibly tiny world of subatomic particles, right? There's actually ongoing research suggesting that these quantum effects might extend into our everyday macroscopic world.
Yes, indeed. Some researchers are finding increasing evidence that quantum phenomena, which were once thought to be relevant only at the smallest scales, might actually manifest in our everyday macroscopic world in subtle but measurable ways. Quantum theory itself doesn't impose a strict size limit on where these effects can occur. It's more a matter of how easily they can be observed and maintained.
So how are we even supposed to picture what's going on in this quantum reality? If a subatomic particle can exist as a wave of probability and then suddenly collapse into a definite localized particle when it's observed, and if its entangled twin instantly mirrors that change, even if it's on the other side of the universe, it's almost like there's another deeper realm of reality operating outside of our familiar three dimensions of space and one dimension of time.
That's certainly one way to try and conceptualize it. This realm of non-local correlations, where seemingly separate objects appear to be instantaneously connected without any discernible signals passing between them through space and time as we understand them, is undeniably spooky and profoundly challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of space, time, and causality.
And speaking of space, even the seemingly empty vacuum of space isn't really empty at all, is it? Our understanding has evolved from this earlier idea of a luminiferous ether filling all of space to the concept of a vacuum. But now we know that this vacuum is actually permeated by various fields, photons, elusive neutrinos, and even something called vacuum energy.
That's absolutely correct. The famous Michelson-Morley experiment, which failed to detect the hypothetical ether, ultimately led Einstein to his revolutionary theory of special relativity, which demonstrated that light propagates through a true vacuum. However, this vacuum is far from being just an empty void. It's now understood to be a dynamic realm teeming with virtual particles that constantly pop in and out of existence, and it possesses a measurable energy density.
This vacuum energy even has directly measurable effects, like the fascinating Casimir effect, where two extremely closely placed metal plates in a vacuum actually experience a tiny but real force pushing them together due to the fluctuating energy of the quantum vacuum between them. It's like there's this hidden underlying power present in what we perceive as completely empty space.
The Casimir effect is indeed a real and experimentally verified phenomenon that provides compelling evidence for the existence and energetic properties of this quantum vacuum. It clearly demonstrates that even what we conventionally think of as empty space is far from inert.
And if space itself isn't this passive, empty container, then maybe our fundamental idea of physical objects being truly and completely separate from one another isn't entirely accurate either. Perhaps these perceived separations are just artificial boundaries that we impose through our language and our limited senses.
The theory of biocentrism actually proposes exactly that. It posits that since the observer and the universe are fundamentally intertwined and correlative, the space out there isn't a pre-existing void, but rather an integral part of a continuum of consciousness. In a sense, the most distant regions of the cosmos are, in some way, located right here within our own minds. Space, in this view, becomes less of an objective stage and more of a tool used by life to organize sensory information.
So this long-held picture of a vast, mostly empty universe might actually be incorrect. Even way back in the 18th century, the philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that space and time aren't actual independent qualities of things in themselves out in the world, but rather fundamental forms of our intuition, representations that exist within us and shape how we perceive reality. They exist only in our thoughts.
Kant's profound philosophical insight resonates strongly with the core tenets of biocentrism, which similarly views space not as an independent physical entity out there, but as a projection originating from within our own minds, where all of our experience begins. It's not an objective phenomenon to be studied in isolation like matter and energy are.
It's almost inconceivable for us to really imagine anything existing without some kind of substance or boundary, even something we call emptiness. So if space isn't this independent empty container, and if time isn't this universal ever-flowing river, what about randomness? That's another really key player in the current standard scientific model, especially when it comes to explaining the process of evolution.
Yeah, the current dominant scientific paradigm relies heavily on the concept of randomness, particularly in explaining the mechanisms of biological evolution through random genetic mutations and the subsequent process of natural selection acting upon those variations. This idea of fundamental chance is often extrapolated to encompass the entire universe and the seemingly accidental rise of life and ultimately consciousness.
And while no one can reasonably deny the powerful role that natural selection plays in explaining how species adapt and change over time, there were some pretty significant challenges and questions that arise when we consider the initial origin of incredibly complex biological structures, like the intricate workings of the human eye.
That's a very valid point. Even the earliest, most primitive form of a light-sensitive organ would have required not just a single light-detecting cell, but also a rudimentary nervous system to transmit that sensory information to a brain, or at least a precursor to a brain, so that the organism could actually utilize that information in some way. A single, isolated, or random mutation that happened to create a light-sensitive cell wouldn't provide any selected advantage to the organism without these other necessary interconnected components also being in place.
Right. It's difficult to picture all of these independent but perfectly interconnected mutations happening simultaneously in a single organism just by sheer chance. It really makes you wonder if there isn't perhaps something more fundamental at play than just blind, undirected chance. And it's not just the complexity of the eye. Think about all the seemingly improbable and finely tuned conditions that make life as we know it possible here on Earth, like the stabilizing influence of our relatively large moon on our planet's axial tilt.
Our moon's very existence, its particular size relative to Earth, and its stable orbit all seem like a remarkably fortunate cosmic coincidence that has played a crucial role in maintaining a relatively stable climate on Earth over vast geological timescales. And it's not the only one. The existence of a gas giant like Jupiter in our solar system, which helps to deflect a significant number of potentially devastating asteroids and comets, or the incredibly precise strength of the strong nuclear force within atoms. These all appear to be remarkably finely tuned for the emergence and sustenance of life as we know it.
It's almost like there's been this incredible, almost unbelievable series of lucky breaks that have allowed us to be here having this conversation. And when you apply Occam's razor, this principle that the simplest explanation is usually the most likely to be correct, biocentrism offers a pretty radical, but also surprisingly simple alternative perspective. Perhaps the universe appears to be so life-friendly precisely because it is, in a very real sense, a life-created reality.
Biocentrism, in its essence, proposes that the universe exhibits the properties and laws that it does because it is fundamentally observed by living conscious beings. Life and consciousness are not just accidental byproducts that emerged within a pre-existing inert universe, but rather fundamental aspects of its very nature and structure.
Now, I know this might sound a little bit out there to some, but let's consider something even more personal, perhaps more universally relatable. The experience of direct, unmediated awareness, this profound sense of unity and interconnectedness that some individuals report having, often referred to as enlightenment or nirvana in various spiritual traditions.
It's true that across diverse cultures and throughout human history, individuals have consistently reported these profound and transformative experiences of interconnectedness, a deep and pervasive sense of oneness that transcends our usual everyday perception of ourselves as separate individuals existing within a linear flow of time and a defined spatial location.
And one of the authors of the book that sparked this whole deep dive actually had such a profound experience himself. A sustained 3-week period of what he describes as complete absence of thought, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity, unity, and interconnectedness with everything. It sounds absolutely incredible, but also quite difficult to fully grasp from our normal, everyday state of consciousness.
Such firsthand accounts, while inherently anecdotal and subjective, can nonetheless offer a different and potentially valuable lens through which to view the fundamental nature of reality. This recurring theme of a deep underlying interconnectedness resonates in some intriguing ways with certain concepts that have emerged from quantum physics, such as the idea of a holistic, non-local, global quantum state that underlies all of reality.
It's almost as if our normal, everyday consciousness acts as a kind of filter, selectively blocking out vast amounts of information and creating the seemingly solid sense of individual self and separate physical objects existing out there. But perhaps there's a much deeper and more fundamental level of reality where everything is intrinsically connected. And maybe our own perception, our conscious awareness, is playing a far more active and crucial role in shaping the reality that we ultimately experience than we typically realize. Think about neurological phenomena like blindsight, where individuals who are clinically blind can still, on some unconscious level, perceive and interact with objects in their visual field without having any conscious awareness of actually seeing them.
Blind sight and other fascinating neurological conditions powerfully demonstrate just how subjective and constructed our view of the world truly is, and how much our complex neural circuitry actively shapes our perception of what we consider to be objective reality. Even the remarkable ability of some organisms, like octopuses, to sense and respond to light without possessing eyes or a centralized brain in the way we understand it, highlights that the capacity for perception isn't limited to our familiar biological mechanisms.
So the vibrant colors that we see all around us, the seemingly vast distances that we perceive between objects, even our fundamental sense of being a separate individual self out here looking at a world out there.
Yeah.
Perhaps all of this is being actively constructed within the confines of our own minds, these incredibly complex and lightning-fast life-based information processing systems.
From this perspective, what we experience as reality is essentially a swirling vortex of information being actively processed within the mind. Our brains are constantly receiving a barrage of sensory input and then working tirelessly to organize and interpret that raw data into the coherent three-dimensional world that we experience, including our deeply ingrained perceptions of space and the linear flow of time.
It's almost like we're constantly in the process of constructing our own individual version of reality. And the tools we use to do this, our senses, our brains, are fundamentally analog, dealing with continuous and subtle nuances rather than just simple digital on-off signals. And our minds seem to be inherently designed to create this seamless and continuous flow of experience. Even if at a fundamental level, it might be based on discrete moments and our brain's remarkable ability to constantly fill in the gaps and create a coherent narrative.
Our minds are indeed incredibly adept at merging together discrete sequences of information to create the illusion of a smooth and continuous experience. Think about how the individual frames in a movie projector, when shown in rapid succession, create the compelling illusion of fluid motion, or how the slightly different images received by our two eyes are instantly processed by the brain to generate our vivid sensation of three-dimensional depth. These internal processing mechanisms powerfully highlight that our perception of reality is not a passive reception of external stimuli, but rather an active and ongoing construction that takes place within the confines of our own brains.
So that feeling of depth we get when we watch a 3D movie, it's not actually out there on the screen. It's a perceptual effect that's being created within our own minds. And if that's true for our perception of depth, then maybe it's also true for the rest of our perceived visual world, and perhaps even for our experience of time. Maybe there isn't a truly independent out there that exists completely separate from the reality that's being constructed within our minds, or if there is, we can't ever directly access or experience it.
That's a very key and crucial point within this perspective. All that we can ever directly know and experience is fundamentally contained within the realm of our own minds, the information that is being processed by our brains. What we perceive as the external world, with its vibrant colors, its tangible textures, and its seemingly solid three-dimensional depth, is ultimately a construction based on underlying phenomena that are themselves invisible to our direct senses, like the invisible electromagnetic fields that constitute what we perceive as light.
Hmm. It really makes you think about the ongoing discussions around artificial intelligence and the possibility of computers eventually becoming conscious. If our own consciousness is so deeply and intrinsically tied to our biological form of information processing, can a machine based on silicon and algorithms ever truly replicate that subjective experience?
Well, while computers are rapidly advancing in their processing power and in their ability to perform increasingly complex tasks, there still appears to be a very significant functional gap between the way the human mind operates and the way even the most sophisticated computers function. Computers excel at tasks like rapid data retrieval and complex calculations, but they often struggle with tasks that are relatively simple for humans, such as understanding the nuances of natural language and generating truly novel abstract ideas. The path towards achieving genuine self-awareness in artificial machines remains a highly speculative and currently unresolved question.
It's also a fascinating thought to consider the possibility that even seemingly simple life forms, like plants, might experience some rudimentary form of consciousness, albeit one that is likely very different from our own. They can clearly sense and respond to their environment. They communicate with each other through chemical signals, and they even seem to exhibit a form of memory, all without possessing a centralized brain in the way that animals do.
Indeed, scientific research increasingly suggests that plants do possess sophisticated mechanisms for processing and storing information about their environment, just not in the centralized manner that animals with brains do. They utilize hormonal signals, electrical impulses, and other complex biochemical pathways to sense and respond to stimuli. And the biocentric view would further suggest that consciousness isn't necessarily limited to beings with brains. Rather, the fundamental relationships of time and space might depend on the entire nature of the detector, even if that detector is a plant.
So this thing we call time, this seemingly constant and universal flow that we all experience, might actually be something far more biological, something inherently subjective that emerges from this continuous and interconnected process of observer and observed reality. And if time doesn't exist as an independent entity outside of our perception, then perhaps even the concept of death isn't the absolute and final end that we often fear it to be.
From this particular perspective, because time itself is not considered to be a fundamental and independent reality, there is no objective experiential after death in the linear sense that we typically imagine. Instead, all of existence could be viewed as occurring within a continuous series of nows. And without an absolute and pre-existing space-time matrix for our energy or consciousness to dissipate into, the very idea of truly going anywhere in a definitive sense becomes problematic.
It's almost as if our consciousness, our individual sense of self and awareness, is like the needle on a phonograph record, constantly manifesting the specific now that we are currently experiencing. All the other possibilities, what we perceive as the past and the future, exist as potential, as information contained on the record. Only the present moment is truly experientially real.
Uh-huh. Any sequence of causal events that leads up to the specific present moment we are experiencing can be thought of as our past, and any potential sequence of events that might unfold from this present moment can be considered our future. But these only truly materialize as concrete experiences when the conscious mind actively creates its three-dimensional, temporally bound reality. The state that existed immediately before what we call death, including our entire current life and all of our accumulated memories, simply reverts back into this realm of pure potential information.
Wow. It's almost as if Parmenides was trying to tell us all along. Reality is ultimately simpler and perhaps even safer than we tend to believe it is. Time and its linear progression of past, present, and future might just be a stubbornly persistent illusion that our consciousness constructs. And with that in mind, the deeply ingrained fear that we, as conscious awareness, will one day simply cease to be. That might just be the biggest illusion of all.
As Albert Einstein himself famously said, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion.
So, in this deep dive, we've journeyed through the profound mysteries of the origin of life, the elusive enigma of consciousness, and finally arrived at this incredibly slippery and counterintuitive concept of time. We've explored how our understanding of the universe has dramatically evolved throughout history. We've touched upon some of the inherent limitations of our current scientific models, and we've seriously considered the possibility that the observer, that's you and me, might actually play a far more fundamental role in shaping the very reality that we perceive. We even looked at how entropy, which we often think of as the definitive arrow of time, might simply be a statistical consequence of probability in the ever-present now.
Right. Think back to those moments in your own life when time seemed to either fly by in an instant or drag on endlessly. Could those subjective and highly personal experiences offer us a subtle clue to the true underlying nature of time? Consider the profound implications if time isn't a fixed and external entity ticking away uniformly for everyone, but something far more fluid, personal, and perhaps even an illusion that is fundamentally created by our own consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. If this fundamental distinction between the past, the present, and the future is, as Einstein so eloquently suggested, merely a stubbornly persistent illusion woven by our minds, then what profound meaning does that have for how we choose to live our lives right now? Perhaps focusing our attention and our energy fully on this very moment, this eternal now, holds a far greater significance and potential than we've ever truly imagined. It's a wild and truly mind-bending thought, isn't it? Definitely something to really chew on long after this deep dive is over. Thanks so much for taking this journey with me.